As we prepare for the next panel, please continue coming back to your seats. And while you do that, I'm pleased to share a short video that really sets the stage for our second panel of the day. Last fall, we partnered with Fulbright scholar Mairead O'Donnell, who led a community case study at Bushwick Inlet Park, which I think everyone in this room knows, but it's the future 27-acre park behind me. There, she developed, through a participatory design process, new urban wilding guidelines. The guidelines reimagine park care as a living, evolving practice, one that's rooted in sustainability, justice, and a deeper connection to the ecosystems around us. Let's take a look at her video.
Hi everyone, my name's Mairead and I'm a Fulbright EPA scholar and PhD researcher working with the Urban Systems Lab and North Brooklyn Park Alliance. My expertise lies in co-designing urban wild spaces with communities, exploring how people, plants, animals, and their environments shape each other within our cities. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. I was really looking forward to joining the summit. It's such an incredible gathering of minds, and I'm truly honoured to share a glimpse of the work that we've been doing in North Brooklyn. I hope this video gives you a sense of the care, creativity, and collaboration that shaped our project at Bushwick Inlet Park. Urban wilding represents a transformative approach to enhancing biodiversity, climate resilience, and community well-being. It asks us to rethink what wildness looks like in the city, not as abandonment, but as intention. At Bushwick Inlet Park, we collaborated with residents, community groups, and local experts to co-design tailored urban wilding guidelines for the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. These guidelines grew from the Future Novel Ecologies workshops. During these workshops, participants shared a deep dedication to preserving biodiversity in a rapidly changing city. We heard real concern about urban habitat fragmentation and a strong drive to protect and expand resilient green and blue spaces. People emphasized the importance of ecological connectivity, linking waterfront parks with green spaces like McCarran Park, and imagined multifunctional landscapes that could simultaneously provide habitat, recreation, and climate adaptation. One recurring theme was balance, how to preserve Bushwick Inlet's beloved wild elements while still adapting to increasing climate risks like flooding, heat, and sea level rise. From these conversations, 4 key recommendations emerged, rooted in community insights and ecological best practices. Number 1, ecological design. Participants highlighted the need for connected habitats, not just within Bushwick Inlet Park, but across the entire North Brooklyn Waterfront. That means thinking about wildlife corridors, contextual planting, and even small-scale wetland habitats that can support species such as amphibians and migratory birds. Number 2, community engagement. Urban wilding isn't just a technical solution, it's a social one. The workshops themselves became a model for how to engage people meaningfully in design. The guidelines emphasize that long-term care depends on cultivating connections. Number 3, multi-species integration. This is one of the most exciting aspects. How do we design with more than human stakeholders in mind? Pollinators, birds, marine life, all of them were part of our planning conversations. This principle asks us to center not just human needs, but also those of non-human residents of the park. Can we design edges for shorebirds to forage? Can we plant species that bloom at different times to support pollinators year-round? Can we rethink fencing and lighting to minimize harm to nocturnal animals? And number 4, governance and policy. None of this is possible without supportive structures. We heard the call for stronger interagency collaboration, consistent maintenance funding, and policies that explicitly support urban wilding goals. When parks departments, community groups, and environmental organizations align, long-term success becomes far more achievable. Bushwick Inlet Park becomes not just an isolated project, but a living, evolving model for the entire waterfront. The guidelines provide a blueprint that can inform future work throughout North Brooklyn and beyond. These efforts don't exist in isolation. Urban wilding aligns closely with broader planning goals, from wetland restoration and stormwater management to climate resilience and cultural relevance. When we prioritize designs that are both ecologically rich and socially meaningful, we create spaces that serve people and ecosystems both equally and intentionally. And we begin to redefine what public space can be. This work is just the beginning. I invite you to explore the guidelines upon their release in the coming months. Share them with your network. And join us in shaping urban spaces where both people and nature can thrive. Let's continue to grow this movement together. Thank you to all the collaborators involved in this process, and thank you for listening.
So Mairead sends her cheers from Dublin today. And a lot of the concepts that she just highlighted are probably going to come up in our next panel, which turns our attention toward the future. Resilient Futures, Iterative Design for the North Brooklyn Waterfront is a panel that invites us to think about what it means to build for climate, ecology, and equity in an era defined by uncertainty. This panel will explore how adaptive design and community-based approaches can help us protect and reimagine our waterfront as a living system, one that serves both people and nature. Throughout the panel, don't forget that you have index cards to jot down your questions, which will be collected throughout. And leading this conversation is our moderator, Brendan Pillar, Deputy Director of Climate and Sustainability Planning at City Planning. Brendan has been instrumental in shaping the 2021 Comprehensive Waterfront Plan and brings a thoughtful, systems-level lens to the challenges ahead. Welcome to the stage, Brendan, and panelists. Come on up.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Katie. I really appreciate the invitation to moderate this amazing panel, and congratulations to you, Katie, and your team for this impressive gathering today. Nice work with the weather, too. The view, top-notch. I think it is so important for us to look back on past planning initiatives and apply lessons learned to our work going forward. And I find this discussion especially timely because the Department of City Planning is about to launch a study of the city's waterfront public access regulations that will touch on many of the topics that we'll be hearing about shortly. These regulations mean that many forms of development in New York City along the waterfront are required to provide publicly accessible open space as a condition of redevelopment. These spaces have come to play an important role in enlivening the waterfront, connecting us to each other and to nature, and increasing our resiliency to climate change. The study will assess what is working well and where there's room for improvement. I'm sure we'll hear lots of ideas to improve these regulations to shape the next generation of waterfront open space. I look forward to moderating the discussion and taking lots of notes. I think it is fitting that as the lone representative of the city here on the stage today, that my job is to ask good questions and to listen. So please allow me to introduce our panelists as we begin what promises to be a very insightful discussion. I'm thrilled to be joined by Tom Balsley, sorry. Tom is a landscape architect and spokesperson for open space and the design public realm. In a career spanning over 40 years, he has contributed to the designs for scores of urban parks and waterfront spaces, including over 100 public and private landscapes throughout New York City. His design philosophy is rooted in equal parts innovation, sustainability, and stewardship, and dedicated to the dual goals of addressing social, cultural, and environmental equity while expanding the public's landscape imagination. Sungjukta Sen is a landscape architectural designer at Field Operations, where she was the project manager and lead designer for the Domino Park and Greenpoint Landing projects. She has taught graduate design studio in landscape architecture department at the University of Pennsylvania and was a fellow at the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where she researched the role of landscape architecture and open space in forefronting resiliency of urban waterfronts. Kate Boycourt leads the New York and New Jersey focused work of the Climate Resilient Coasts and Watershed team at the Environmental Defense Fund, working at the intersection of wetland policy and flood protection. She is focused on fostering partnerships to collectively advocate for comprehensive, evidence-based, and equitable policies and investments that build on resiliency for all. Prior to her work at EDF, Kate held multiple roles focusing on consensus and coalition building, resiliency design guidelines, and policy development. Finally, Veronica Olivaldo is a project manager at the Urban Systems Labs at the New School. Her research focuses on managed retreat as a strategy for climate adaptation, taking into account present and past distributive, recognitional, and procedural injustices in coastal environments. She previously worked on climate adaptation at the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies in Rotterdam and on sustainable tourism at the Scottish Institute of Sustainable Technology in Edinburgh. In her free time, she co-runs Moffett Street Community Gardens in Bushwick. Please welcome our panelists. So our agenda for this panel discussion, I have a few opening questions I would like to ask all of the panelists. Then we'll dive into a little bit more of each panelist's subject matter expertise. So to open us up, contemporary waterfront planning tends to forefront environmental challenges, whether climate-related or ecological. However, back in 2005, these topics did not receive the attention they do today. As a result, over the past 2 decades, we have witnessed significant development shape North Brooklyn's waterfront in varying ways. In your view, what adaptive strategies have been effective at addressing the environmental challenges we face, and where do you think gaps remain? Tom, do you want to kick us off?
Okay. Yeah. Sure, I'd love to. Thank you. I have to point to what started out as the Queens West master plan that stretched 13 blocks up from what we now know as Hunters Point South, but it goes all the way up to Annabelle Basin. I think most of us in North Brooklyn know that waterfront just beyond the boundary. And you're absolutely right. And in the early planning, I think we thought less about the resiliency matters. Although I will say that we always took into account the social, the cultural, the economic factors that should always go into public open space planning and design. But as that master plan developed further, the first phase of it was Gantry Plaza State Park, which you may know, and it consists of 4 piers that existed as industrial piers originally. They were reimagined as sort of what the New York Times art critic called marine follies. I love that term. I've stolen it and reused it. But we thought we would actually, way back then, and that was in 1996, 1998, we thought we could capture and create habitat, native wetland habitat or marine habitat, marsh habitat, if we created some barriers, and temporary barriers between the piers. So we created the land, we fashioned the land in a way to do that. A little introduction into wilding way back then, if you will. And that was all in concert with the State Environmental Protection Agency, and they were giving us advice of what we could and couldn't do, what would work and what wouldn't work. And when they were installed, it only took a couple of months of storms and high tides to basically take it all out to sea. So it was a hard lesson learned, although Gantry Plaza State Park continued to be a little bit of a wildness in a plaza, social spaces mixed together as a kind of what we hoped was going to be a model for the rest of the city. Let's call it the alternative to Battery Park City at the time. So fast forward to when we started Hunters Point South, we took a good hard look at the historic maps and realized that really back in 1600 or so, there was actually marsh along the Queens shoreline. The width of the river was probably double what it is now. And the marsh was there because there was a slower river, a less powerful river. And we thought, well, yes, we're going to recreate the industrial heritage of this place, which we love to, worship and celebrate, share, but why not the natural history of this place as well? So we sort of put these two things together, a little bit of heritage, a natural history heritage, together with the resiliency. Can we recreate a marsh and have that marsh be that working performative landscape that is going to help us buffer this community to invite, absorb, release, et cetera. And while we were at it, and this is where Hunters Point South, I think, was somewhat innovative. We said, well, in order to do that, the engineers said, well, you've got to have a little revetment here. And revetment sounded engineering-like. And we thought, okay, well, from our experience with Gantry Plaza State Park, I guess we're going to have to do that if we're going to have a marsh. But then we started thinking, well, what is a revetment? Who says how wide it should be? And then we started thinking, well, if we just widen this revetment, then we can actually allow the public down there close to the water all the time, all the days of the year, except maybe a sandy storm, while at the same time greening the insides of it. So as you're walking around Hunters Point South, you have that wilding effect, that moment, I think, I try to describe it as you're captured between this very natural world and then that skyline. What a dialogue. And it was the ability to create the marsh, create the upland slopes with a native grass, a little blue stem, and a combination of all of those materials all came together to create that experience while still being performative.
That's wonderful, thank you. I really love the idea of understanding, appreciating, and working with water. I have a feeling it's going to be a cross-cutting theme across our conversation this afternoon. Veronica, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think 2 points. There's a need to balance protecting people from soil contamination versus increasing permeable surfaces. Dealing with toxics, it would be good to just tarmac everything over, but we can't do this because of increasing intense rainfalls. And so keeping the soil from being tarmacked means that then we need to do better lawn management. And I think I wanted to give a shout out to the North Brooklyn neighbors for the soil testing study that they did in 2024. And I know there's other soil testing studies that are going on in North Brooklyn, but it really looked at 69 open spaces between Williamsburg and Greenpoint, and 50 of those 69 had higher than New York State Development and Environmental Conservation levels of lead, and 6 out of 69 had higher levels of arsenics. So this means that already now the parks that we have and that we love, McCarran Park, McGorry Park, Marsha P. Johnson Park, have an extremely high level of these pollutants. So I think moving forward, we need to increase budget for open space management, increase budget for better lawn management, that is, yes, bringing grass, but not just grass, thinking about what other surfaces we can include to separate people from soil, wood chips. So I think these are all things that the city needs to be better at doing. And yes, more soil studies. I think this one was one of the soil studies that have been done, but there's, I think, more the better. And then another need, I think, is balancing climate adaptation needs with housing needs. Now, when you ask what has been effective, also ask, I guess, to what, right? So I think Is Domino Park an effective park in terms of stormwater absorbance? Well, I'm not sure who's monitoring this. Maybe. Is it? I know it's been built with, and Sanjukta will probably speak about this. It has a slope that goes from it's been elevated between 2 and 7 feet. Will this be enough for the next storm surge event that we will witness? Well, it doesn't really account for New York City panel on climate change sea level rise projections. So I think we have to use a precautionary principle in talking about what's been effective, because we don't know. I think the last point I want to make is, which is probably not very popular, but the latest Regional Planning Association report, I think, is very, very important. And it looks at, it tells New York City to consider regional housing needs along with city needs. So it's a report that looks at current residential development capacity between New York City, Long Island, and Westchester County. And the current need allows for less than half, so 45% of the total housing needed by 2040. And this leaves a net deficit of approximately 680,000 units. Now, to meet both this demand and future needs, including the housing that we may lose to flooding in this whole area, which amounts to approximately 82,000 units by 2040 and probably 160,000 units by 2070, we need to then think about how to increase this zoning development capacity also outside of New York City. So thinking about housing, not just building in a floodplain, but thinking about where can we build elsewhere in the region. And that means changing the laws in Long Island and Westchester County. So a lot of work ahead.
Thank you, appreciate it. Kate?
Yeah, I like that point a lot. And if you want sort of a cheat sheet to that report, I highly recommend there's a New York Times article on it. And we're actually working directly with Regional Plan Association and Association for Neighborhood Housing Development on trying to think about, okay, given that, what is the policy change that we need to make to get us to a pro-development, anti-risk kind of agenda, and might touch on that later. But I'm going to step way back, but not go too long, to 1972. When we passed the Clean Water Act. I didn't, I wasn't born yet, but it is the reason we are here today. This would not be here if we still had rivers that were polluted and smelled and fish killed. We still do have that, right, in New York, but it's really changed to the point where, on average, the Hudson River meets swimmable water quality standards. It's not good enough in Newtown Creek. It's not good enough in many. I think you'll hear from Andrea Parker later in Gowanus Canal. But we've made this tremendous progress, and this is the sort of double-edged sword result of that, to Veronica's point, where we have built a tremendous amount of density at the water's edge, specifically in this neighborhood and others. And so I think one of the positive things that has worked is clean water regulations, and I think the gap there is kind of what Veronica's getting at, which is we did this amazing job, and I'll touch on this piece too in the waterfront plan and kind of re-envisioning our waterfront. There's this incredible sort of string of green parks going from Bush Terminal, Piers Park, to the Michael Van Valkenburg, the Brooklyn Bridge Park, to up here, Sanjukta and Tom's parks. They're called something else, you know what they are. But I give them credit because these guys are great, and they're good at incorporating green things into their parks, like wetlands. And those were things that we hadn't done for a couple hundred years. These were really industrialized vertical piers, which don't do well for wildlife. And so I think, going forward, in terms of the and honestly, I've found a baby horseshoe crab in Brooklyn Bridge Park, and to me that is the measure of success when we actually have function as well as form. And so I think that the overall sort of theme of any comments I make today will be to sort of go beyond the edge, whether that's thinking about the community, that's thinking about resilience, that's thinking about housing. I think we've done a really good job of starting to think about the edge, but we might have missed some things in not going further. And there's ways I think we can do that.
Yeah, I can totally appreciate how thinking beyond the edge touches on this like idea about working with water more, where maybe in the past we set up barriers to the water because it was seen as maybe something unsafe or hazardous, and certainly was at times. But now that regulations have played a role in cleaning up our waterways, there are certainly some opportunities to work more with water and redefine what is the edge. So, Jed, you want to take the first question?
Yeah, and thanks for that segue, Kate. I think beyond the edge is exactly where things are going, right? I think, and I'll step back a little bit, not all the way back to 2005, because though that was really helpful to hear in the first panel, some of the historical perspective of how the rezoning was born and came about. I can say from my personal perspective and our perspective in field operations, when we started these projects, both Greenpoint Landing and Domino Park, they came right after Sandy hit, right? So it was a moment where the rezoning itself was reacting to an event, right? And to your earlier point, Brendan, the 2005 zoning may not have accounted for these events, but we had to very quickly, as designers, as I'm sure you did, Tom, with 100 Point South, react to it. And I think what we found throughout that entire tract of waterfront was the conditions are wildly different, right, in every moment of the river. And it's not easy to say, well, we can have a continuous green infrastructure or a continuous ecologically performative infrastructure. It was, and the second piece of it was the instinct to just react to the flood maps, right? Just raise everything and just go to a design flood elevation of 13 or 16 or whatever your spot was supposed to be. I think the early projects, in many ways, are a reaction to that initial panic of, oh, what if there's yet another Sandy Lake, which was a 700-year event, I think, by the time they figured out all the math of it. So I would say, again, to your point, Veronica, a lot of the early efforts at kind of squaring that circle of how do you deal with resiliency and public space were a reaction, a very quick reaction of reacting to these new elevations, understanding that the surrounding context of the city wasn't built up to those new targets yet, and how do you set a new infrastructure on the shoreline? I will say this even as in the last 5 or 6 years, as we have continued working along the riverfront, working with the community, talking with the community, many faces that I see here today, I think the understanding is that it cannot be only resiliency, right? We need access, we need ecological improvement, we need to, where we can, the best we can do for ecological enhancements. Now, again, it's important to stress here that it's an engineering exercise, as Tom was referring to. It's not equally possible everywhere to achieve all of these things. But even as we have sort of continued with planning projects on the shoreline, increasingly this instinct of just pushing your feet up from the water has changed, right? People increasingly want the co-benefits of access, of water access, not just amenity access, of water access, of being able to launch a kayak into the water, of reaping the benefits of an increasingly cleaner river. Water quality, believe it or not, in both the rivers, Hudson and the East River, is improving. So can these rivers become amenities also? So beyond the edge, can people start actually using the water itself? Those have become real questions and real design drivers for us, I think, as we have moved forward. So I will just say it's been a real evolution. Working on the shoreline, and which we think is in the right direction. Sure, absolutely. A lot has changed in the 30 years since we've had these waterfront public access requirements, and you're giving me a lot of good food for thought for what this study can be focusing on. I really marvel at the
example of getting down to the waterfront and being able to have a relationship with water. At the DEP Water Pollution Control Plant, you have the Get Down There, which I think was a pretty radical idea when it was initially designed. Who would ever want to get down to the Newtown Creek? But it really has become an expectation that people not just have a connection to the edge of the water, but to the water itself. So my attempt with the first question is to really take a look back. I think we also started to take a look ahead, but let me get to my second question here. Maybe we can go in reverse order. So based on what we've learned, how can we ensure we're thinking more holistically about waterfront development, including considerations for other species, the history of our waterfront and its future, and meaningful representation in design discussions and policymaking?
Me to go again?
Would you like to take a stab at that
Tom's
first?
like, yeah, you do.
Yeah.
So I think if you sort of zoom out a little bit, where there have been successful sort of interventions, let's call them, right? Like I think Brooklyn Bridge Park, Hudson River Park, there's something interesting about them in that they function in a sort of larger critical mass, right? Like they have there's a certain master plan, there's some ability to create swaps between cut and fill, create a little bit of exchange, if you will, between the different edge conditions. So I think one thing that would really help with policy making is, I think city planning, I see this on city planning's Insta a lot. There's 520 miles of shoreline, right? Finding that critical mass of planning for the shoreline, I think as a designer, that would be a really great guideline. In some ways, maybe the Greenpoint Williamsburg master plan could have been that, like being a critical mass of shoreline for a kind of comprehensive shoreline plan, or even, I think somebody was mentioning this, it's not just coastal flood risk, but it's also stormwater management and interior drainage that need to be addressed. So using the planning module as a sort of critical mass setting strategy, so that we are not dealing with sites in a piecemeal fashion, not just in terms of access, but also resiliency as an infrastructure.
I really appreciate that comment, and would just observe that one of the things I think the city has done to kind of move on that more kind of holistic vision for the shoreline is to create within the Department of Environmental Protection a specific bureau that focuses on coastal resiliency, but that can also touch on other expertise within the Department of Environmental Protection on stormwater resiliency and other kind of flood-related issues, so that all of that thinking can be done in one place, and that coordination can be launched out of that bureau. So I think that's one example of a positive step forward in that regard. Kate, you work a lot at the intersection of policy and the shoreline. What other things should we be thinking about outside of maybe the city's regulations in terms of what happens on the shoreline?
I like that punt there, Brendan. But also I was going to give you the city of Pass anyway. But I think one of the things that is non-regulatory that I think we could be doing more of, and then I'll speak briefly to regulatory. We did some way back when I worked at Hudson River Foundation, and we were trying to figure out a way, and so this is related to the state, to better measure habitat quality of different shoreline types. We recognize that East River is a really hard, dynamic environment that, as Tom mentioned, is super narrow, super fast, and is very hard to design for. But one of the challenges is because we used to do really bad things at the waterfront, the regulations got a lot stricter, and it is hard to do good things sometimes from a habitat perspective. And part of the way that the state and others think about this is, what is the value of this particular type of shoreline treatment compared to another? And it's actually a very difficult scientific question, because how do you measure the value of a riprap edge versus a vertical edge versus a beach? We can go into it after the panel if you want to, but we actually got some scientists to work together on this, kind of inspired by Seattle. If you've ever been to Seattle, the Olympic Sculpture Park, a lot of these other parks were designed actually with researchers that focused on salmon. And they found that they were able to incorporate design features that better provided habitat for forage, for salmon, and things like that. And so I think, some of that thinking through design guidelines, through people inventing things like concrete that's more sensitive, have enabled us to incorporate that more into design and make that popular. I think from maybe a regulatory framework, we could get a little bit more sophisticated in how we think about these other options rather than making it easier to replace in kind, which means if you are replacing a bulkhead that was already there, it is kind of easier to do that than to cut or add a little bit of fill to get to a shallower edge, which is what we would have to do in a lot of these cases. And you can hear war stories from Sanjukta and Tom after the panel, I'm sure, on that. And so I think that there's ways to incorporate materials and other things to kind of get permitting moved quicker and preferentially for different types of projects. But I think all of that needs to be thought about extremely carefully because sometimes people will find loopholes and will figure out ways to fill a ton in the water without necessarily a strong ecological purpose. And then I think, also regulatory-wise, there's more that we could be doing in terms of frameworks to incentivize private as well as public to pay for resiliency features that fit with a broader context and risk profile of the neighborhood.
I will piggyback on that one for one moment, though it does take longer to permit something that is green rather than bulkhead replacement, which is, I think, your point. And you still can't put that in the water without carving back land. So the cotton fill, even if you're putting something in the water, has to remain equal, which is, I think, the point you're trying to make. But the case for beneficial fill, I think, is what is a little bit of the gap, yeah.
I'll just pile on. It also comes with it this requirement sort of for guardianship of that green, where the bulkhead doesn't really require any guardianship. So there's all these factors that we're all working against towards.
Yeah, I wanted to step back a little bit in this question of like representativeness and meaningful representation. I think the time is ripe in New York City for innovations in the way we do governance and deliberation. I would love to see the city and other, even private institutions, putting thinking, money behind rethinking how we engage with citizens' decision-making. I think, and somebody mentioned it before, that like processes like the ULURP, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, or the city environmental quality review. These are processes that are not really conducive to a genuine public input, serious deliberation. And, I think, what does representativeness mean? I'm always reminded of Anna Arendt's words on this, that she thinks that representativeness is imagining the perspective of others. So I form an opinion by listening to how other people's viewpoints and reminding myself about who is absent in the room. So I like this definition because it reminds us that representativeness is a responsibility. And it reminds us that representation is non-inclusive by definition. There's just so many reasons why people cannot attend community board meetings. They might not have the bandwidth to do that from 7 to 9 p.m. on a Friday night. They might not feel safe in these environments. So I think, and I was previously, Raisa from El Puente was telling me, was in the audience, was telling me that, she was thinking about hoping to receive this grant money from EPA that then was canceled, to think about how can we better do community board meetings, like thinking about having an environmental advisory board to extend the powers of community board as an institution. So I think these things are really important, and I also, I would say one last thing. I have a laundry list of things that I would like to see a proper deliberation process occur in New York City. One thing that I would say is that a commitment to deliberation means that we don't brush off people's emotions or conflicts, seeking consensus. So I think democracy is about conflict. That's what democracy is about. So thinking through these processes, slowing down the pace of decision making, especially when we have to think about like what climate change is, and like so. I think slowing down the pace, employing expert facilitators, and fostering a climate of honesty about historic disenfranchisement or issues of equity, and most crucially, I think transparency. So how have claims discussed in a meeting, how can they be tracked and traced to see how they end up making up the final decision? So I think these are all points that I would like to bring to this issue. I could say more about multi-species, but we can maybe come back later.
That's certainly applause-worthy and something I say has evolved or adapted since the 2005 era of planning. I can say, having been involved in processes where we lead up, multi-year engagement with neighborhoods that are, we're considering neighborhood plans even before we get to ULURP, and I can see how varying just where we meet, the times we meet, the locations of the meetings, meeting people more where they are instead of at necessarily a community board meeting, has meaningfully improved engagement in my observation. Okay, let's zero in a bit more on our design-related questions. So Thomas and Sanjukta, these two are for you. Both of you have experience designing transformative urban waterfront landscapes. What are the biggest challenges and opportunities you see in adapting New York City's waterfront to the climate challenges of today and tomorrow?
Money. Not necessarily in that order, but it's on the list. No, I think the biggest challenge for New York, this actually ties back to this previous question, which is it requires a holistic approach. Holistic strategies, but kind of a redefinition of what that means for us. So when we think of resiliency, we don't think of just environmental, ecological resiliency. We think social, cultural, economical, total holistic resiliency. And when we think about how we might go about conducting ourselves as designers, taking on a site, for resiliency, we don't even pretend to think that we can do it ourselves. Just starting with the design team, it requires the assemblage of a design team of people who believe in collaboration, who believe that in the math of collaboration, which is 1 + 1 = 3. And then if you start adding a few more ones in there, it goes beyond my math, it gets into calculus, but it has to go all the way back to the roots of the community, that the upland community or what will be the new community. In a way, Gantry Plaza State Park is a perfect example of how that worked. We had no opportunity to have a dialogue with the community before we designed Gantry Plaza State Park, because to have conducted a conversation with us about what kind of park they might have wanted would have been offering a tacit approval for the development that was coming with it. It was a very interesting dynamic. So we were sort of on our own, but we had done enough work in public open space and waterfronts that we knew what we were up against. So that dialogue actually paid off, because when we went to Hunters Point South, we had already, Gantry Plaza State Park had already attracted the Friends of Gantry Plaza State Park. And they then became another piece of that community voice that helped sort things out with the community board. And all of that is what I call that holistic view of the design approach and the planning approach. So it's got to be that broad. I'd just leave it at that.
That's great.
I'd say the challenge of the current time is, to me, always is that by the time, it's a moving target, right? Resiliency, by definition, is a moving target. By the time we do start designing a project, the risk has already shifted, right? So I think communicating to the community, to the stakeholders, that there is a probabilistic approach to our design, is something that's sometimes a challenge. And I think as a set of people who are interested and hopefully by now have gained some expertise in this, that we find a better language for communicating probabilistic design as opposed to this is an absolute thing. It'll meet the flood elevation of 13 and you're good. You're protected forever. I think that is something that we need to get into our vocabulary.
Well, I can certainly appreciate if there's a dire need for better collaboration and coordination, we also need to be speaking a similar language and one that we can all wrap our heads around. One other question related to design. Both of your work has often bridged urban landscapes with community needs. What innovative approaches or even small-scale interventions should designers consider as they address the multi-purpose demands of these spaces, which serve simultaneously as public amenities, corridors for people and wildlife, and resilient infrastructure? And I'll remind the panelists to try and keep the microphones closer to your mouth so everyone in the audience can hear. Would you like to start, Tom?
Yeah, sure. I have to point, I'm sorry, because it's right there, Hunter's Point South. So I'll keep referencing that because I think everyone knows it well. When we had received what we thought was a consensus program from the community, I think one of the great successes of the park was we were able to convince the community that there should be a large kind of common ground for the community to meet and cross paths, but there didn't have to be another ball field. And that's tough when you're working with a community that doesn't have enough ball fields. And so when we're balancing nature versus ball fields, it's an interesting dialogue. You don't do a half a football field. So it reminds me that the open green oval at Hunters Point South is sort of what I call the great democratic ground of that park. And it started out in our minds as just a great green oval instead of a ball field, but it was surrounded by the seat wall edge that you notice. The ball is contained. If you want to take your son out to teach him how to kick the ball around, that would be fine. And sit and watch the activity that might erupt out there, or there's a high school across the street. It all made a lot of sense. However, the Parks Commissioner said that's impossible for us to keep that as natural lawn. And the Planning Commissioner said, no, it's got to be a natural lawn. And it went back and forth, and we finally got a sketch. Yes, it was faxed back then, I think. But it was basically the oval with a rectangle in the middle of it of artificial turf for a field surrounded by natural. And so we took, what we did is we took that and we tried to make lemonade out of lemons. We created another oval within the oval, artificial turf, so all of that kind of civic activity could take place in this amazing little bowl of social cross-fertilization. And then the natural lawn, we put a little topography to it so it never would become an area for balls to be kicked. These are these design strategies that come out of these conversations and a different way of looking at things. And I look at it always as that great example of how our design innovation can apply itself to those kinds of challenges.
I can also appreciate that, if I have my information correct, that the oval is also a stormwater retention facility. So perhaps having natural grass there, it would have eliminated the co-benefit to have some recreational space that could also serve some.
Thank you for that. I forgot to mention.
It's a favorite park of mine, so I know it well.
Okay.
I think some of the things, lessons learned for us that I think we'll move forward with definitely is, I'll go back to this issue of every part of the shoreline being so different and not falling prey to the sort of green trap, let's call it. Every intervention cannot be, we can't have salt marshes everywhere, we can't have eelgrass everywhere, much as I'd love to do that, but it's, the rivers we live and work within, they just are not conducive to consistently green strategies. So not closing ourselves to, performative gray strategies and a hybrid approach to engineering the shoreline, I think is something I would really emphasize on. And again, this is, I think, something that can find its way into the pedagogical language of city agencies, et cetera, as well, where people start learning that even though it looks like concrete, it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, right? So there are ways to do performative shorelines and strategies that can work together and create equally good, or at least measurably good outcomes, right? So I would say that's something to really build on as we move forward.
Thank you. Okay, turning to Kate and Veronica now. So this question is to both of you. In your work, you suggest policy recommendations to reduce flood risk in the medium to long term. What specific policies or governance frameworks would you advocate for to better integrate resiliency into waterfront development while prioritizing ecological restoration? Veronica, you want to take that one first?
Yes. So in my research, I studied Edgemere, the community of Edgemere in Rockaway. That's been going through decades of disinvestment, failed promises, a little bit like in North Brooklyn, but the kind of makeup of the community is very different. It's low to moderate income, predominantly black and brown. And so I studied how vacant land that was left over because of failed urban renewal, the promised housing that didn't come, also because of the financial crisis, and how this land can be repurposed, also considering needs for property buyouts. So there's been a bunch of property buyouts following Superstorm Sandy. The city is thinking kind of creatively, I have to admit. They're thinking about, some retreat, thinking about some housing infill in areas that are, for now, less at risk of flooding. The Army Corps of Engineers has a plan to create greenways connecting the entire Bay area facing Jamaica Bay. So there's a lot going on, and it clearly shows that one solution is not going to cut it. And so I'm grateful for this kind of comprehensive thinking. Now, at the same time, though, if you speak to people living there, this kind of these distributive inequities that they've been going through over decades have created senses of betrayal, mistrust, neglect, and these sentiments are real, and they show up in the form of less community involvement in community board meetings. There's a disaffection, and that's absolutely understandable. So, so the more we do visioning with these communities, the less they come out at this point, because they don't see actual improvements. So the visioning project that I studied with RISE, Rockaway Institute for Sustainability and Equity, Pratt Institute was involved, was to sort of thinking about how can we reuse these vacant lots, considering what the community really wants. So these were spaces that they wanted to repurpose for employment opportunities, food security, ecological benefits. And the issue was that a lot of these lots were city-owned, and so at the end of the visioning process, because of lack of mandate that certain departments had over these city lots, they couldn't be immediately repurposed for interim uses. So this sort of built again this trust so it's like a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think in this condition, and I'm not sure whether this would work here, but the concept of restorative justice, I think, is very important. Restorative justice, Ben Almasi wrote a lot about this, comes from Margaret Walker, who is an African-American poet and writer, and basically is about doing ecological restoration as a means of relationship reparations. So this is not just, Margaret Walker often talk about financial reparations, these are more relationship reparations. So in her mind, it's about getting community with perpetrators of environmental degradation together to do actual work. This could be planting seedlings, it could be doing soil testing. So there needs to be a sense that the community has again, moral standing in their neighborhood and sort of rewrites narratives of harm in different ways. So this is something that I mean, I'm not sure whether anybody here would be interested in doing actual restorative justice, but I think working with perpetrators such as Chevron or other companies here that have done so much harm in this neighborhood, I mean, I'm not saying that it will do it, but it would be good to think.
Kate, before I turn it to you, I just got to note this is the last call for submitted questions. So if you would like to ask questions of the panelists, please turn them into the folks walking around the room. Thanks.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think there has been a lot of planning in some areas. There's a lot of student projects. People feel overplanned and underdelivered. And I think there are some solutions to that, in addition to just how we interact with each project, each plan, and I think Brendan spoke to that a little bit. In terms of some things that I think need to happen to sort of get up the infrastructure to get us there a little bit more, the city did something good a couple of years ago in developing the first ever Bureau of Coastal Flood Resilience. We didn't have an office that dealt with this. After Hurricane Sandy, it took us a long time to figure out. It was sometimes it's EDC's responsibility because they own the land, or it's DEP's responsibility, or it's the mayor's office, maybe, but maybe also Department of Construction, Design, and it's very difficult if you're a user, a New Yorker, to understand who's in charge and who's managing this. And I think it's also concerning if you don't have that entity and a resourced version of that entity to make sure that we are prepared and that we're captaining and preparing for the next disaster and hopefully preventing it. And so we need to fund that office. It's not really well funded. There's very little funding, and they are responsible for the operations and maintenance, planning and design of all of these projects that do and don't exist. And that's scary to me. So I think that's one. It's also headed by an amazing person, Lorian Farrell. And I think, I know she has the intent of trying to get to every neighborhood that we have left out so far because of resources and lack of resources. And I think, the city could do that with resources and also make sure that we're building from existing plans and taking what communities have already developed to start from. So I think that's an opportunity. I think there's also needs to be a long-term funding source for this, maybe some sort of almost utility in the same way we manage stormwater, or hopefully, it's a state level act we need to change. But I think this is something that the entire city should be resourcing, and we might need to have a dedicated line item for that if we want to keep living in the city. And there's got to be an equitable way to structure that so that it's not just Lower Manhattan, it's not just certain neighborhoods, and we are cross-subsidizing that in an equitable way, recognizing the historic harms that Veronica mentioned. Governance, coordinated governance, of course, we're working on a state-level bill for that called the Climate Resilient New York Act. It's not New York City specific, but I think there are a lot of things that could be done at the state level. New Jersey's doing a great job. We don't like to be outdone by New Jersey. And they're actually getting threatened now by the Trump administration for putting in really progressive land use rules that actually require, it's sort of like states' rights, but not when it's not convenient. But it's, they're actually requiring future flooding to be incorporated in design in a way that I don't think any other state is quite to that level. So that's sort of another thing. Funding, making sure the office is empowered, and I think, working with Brendan and his team to do more adaptation planning across the city.
Looking forward to it. And I can't pass up the opportunity to say that the city is doing well in some areas, but also have to observe that just because we're doing well does not mean we're done. We have a lot more work to do ahead of us. Kate, so this question is for you. You've written opinion pieces that raise pressing questions about equity and climate adaptation. How can waterfront projects in North Brooklyn and beyond ensure that resiliency strategies are distributed equitably, particularly for historically marginalized communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think Veronica's touched, excuse me, about to sneeze. Nope. Okay. Veronica's touched a lot on a lot of this, but I think the neighborhood has changed. It's no secret, and so I think I just want to echo the things that Veronica's already mentioned in terms of outreach, but also really going beyond the site in terms of who we're trying to reach. And being super intentional about that. I think it's extremely critical in this neighborhood where the waterfront residents are no longer who they used to be necessarily. And I think WEAC does a really good job of this. They actually go out and are engaged and have organizers going into NYCHA buildings. They host things there. So it's about where you hold the conversation, who you talk to, what language you're speaking, a lot of the things that I think you've already mentioned. So I think that's just sort of a lesson to any designer planning opportunity to really do, and we kind of worked into the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines when we were working on it, is how do you have a real assessment of the community to be your baseline from which you figure out your strategy to make sure people can participate, and maybe even have an advisory committee that's sourced from those that aren't well represented.
I think you raise a really interesting point, and I'm sure, Tom, you have this debate in your office too. When we design amenities in parks and open spaces of this nature, this is always a question, like what balances a destination and what to a neighborhood park, right? Like that's the constant kind of balance that one has to strike. And very often, you think as a designer, you're controlling it, but it can change over time, right? Like something that starts as a neighbor, specifically something that the neighborhood has asked for, spirals into something that is a lot that has a much more regional impact. Let's say, right? People are traveling from far away, and to your point, going much further beyond the site to examine that. But I think more and more, any outreach we do to the community has to take that into account, that explicitly that question of what wants to be here, right? Like I think we try to do that as practitioners, but if it is a if these are these kinds of parks which are almost like a joint endeavor of the city and a developer, like how do we make sure there's some of that control exercised, right? Like that's important.
I just pick up on that because it reminds me of we were doing a pretty large project in DC and tried very much with outreach, community meetings, et cetera, and well, what time of the day were they? Sometimes in the middle of the day or towards the end of the day at dinner time. I'm always suspicious of our conventional way of finding a conversation with all the levels of the community, age-wise and income-wise, whatever. And so it was interesting because as we were nearing the finalization of the design program, COVID came. Oh, well, we can't have any meetings. Oh, we'll have to go online. Oh, we'll have to invent a new way to reach out and have this dialogue. And it was more effective online, where families could go online at a meeting, at dinner time or after dinner time while their kids are studying, or maybe it's a dual income, one's working but one's still at home. It was a way of saying, wait a minute, maybe the whole community meeting in the church or whatever isn't the most effective way to reach out to these people, and maybe technology can be embraced and put to work in this regard. It was just it really opened our eyes, and we've tried to suggest it with more recent projects, and we've gotten a very good outcome out of it. We get more comments from those evening hours online responses than we do in the meetings. And they have I think they're pretty good in terms of all income levels. I mean, all age levels, which is really tough to get to community meetings.
You're really bringing me back, Tom. That's the exact experience we had when my team was helping the city prepare its comprehensive waterfront plan. We quickly had to transition our in-person meetings to remote meetings, but we also had the experience of really deepening the engagement as a result of identifying and using virtual tools for engagement and really expanding that process. And I must say that we've taken those lessons learned from comprehensive waterfront planning efforts and incorporating that into how we do approach neighborhood planning.
That's
So,
good for all.
absolutely. Before I get to the questions from the audience, Veronica, I have one last question for you. Your work is focused on the social drivers of flood risk, incorporating the lived experiences of marginalized communities in discussions about climate change. What are some insights that can inform our dialogues with communities and designing waterfront areas?
Yeah, I think I sort of a bit responded to this question earlier out of enthusiasm, but I think maybe I'll say a few more points about the project in Edgemere. So we also, we had 3 visioning workshops between 2021 and 2022. The first one, we were able to have it in person, and a lot more people from Edgemere actually showed up. It was at Rise, which is a place that actually, so Edgemere is a very interesting, there's like social, symbolic, and geographical divisions, the bay and the kind of like ocean front. And so Rise is not very close to a lot of where the bay area, so there's like at least a 20-minute walk. So still we had way more Edgemere participation than when we had to move it online for the second and third workshop. So what I noticed, and I was asking people who know, because like I was kind of like the outsider, and I was asking Rise, so but who do you see in the audience in these like Zoom, who are these people? Because there was an influx of participation. And I was like, is it Edgemere residents? And actually, no, there were people from Manhattan, from Brooklyn, who kind of were interested in joining the visioning, listening in, learning. And so kind of Edgemere got crowded out in the Zoom meetings, which was bad for Edgemere, but it was also good in terms of ideas. We got new ideas from people that have lived in similar circumstances of thinking about how to reuse vacant land. So, I mean, Zoom is, I don't know, it's a double-edged sword. I think it can work, and sometimes it kind of crowds out who you really want to be in the room. So, yeah, a lot of, but then again, outreach, I mean, Rise is constantly understaffed. And so they were saying, Vero, we're happy that you're here seconding us. So going door by door with, they have a whole program on shore courts that teaches students ecological awareness and sustainability. They do amazing work, but they were not really well connected to the Bay Area. So we had to go out there door to door, and many doors were not open. Many people that we spoke to in the streets didn't come. So the outreach effort, it's still kind of like a very analog thing. I mean, you can do flyering, you can do a website, but it's really like you need to look in people's eyes and say, hey, this is important. The other big piece is coalition building. So I feel that outreach is very much connected to the quality of organizations that you have in your neighborhood. The quality is it's about word, but like the outreach that these organizations have and the connections that they find between each other. So I think Edgemere is a highly fragmented community where even coalition building is complicated. It's complicated by all these years of segregation where residents and renters look at each other in kind of like homeowners and renters look at each other in kind of suspicious ways. So it's sort of hard even for organizations to bring these people together. So I think we need more constant funding for community-based organizations because they know the people, and if we have a chance of doing better outreach is by overly funding community-based organizations.
That's wonderful, and I will observe the multiple times funding has come up in this conversation this afternoon. Let us turn to some questions from the audience. I haven't had time to flip through all of them yet, so I'll just go in the order that I received them. So regarding Hunters Point South, would the city have been better served by leaving the park more natural rather than so developed at the creek, specifically Newtown Creek? Tom, you want to take on that one? I know it's not squarely pointed at you.
I'm not sure I'm in the right, but you know, is it going to be snail darters or is it going to be our 3-year-olds having a place to play? We those of us in this wonderful world of public open space design are constantly facing this tug of war of the built environment versus the natural environment, the active recreation uses versus the passive recreation uses, et cetera, et cetera. We have opinions when we take on a project, and then we go through a community dialogue process, and our opinions are changed. And I think I can speak for most of us, that we try our best to synthesize all of that with the help of our sponsors, help create what we call a consensus program, and part of that consensus programming is determining how much of this is going to be a native environment and how much is going to be more of a constructed environment. The problem is, just like in the argument between the ball fields versus the passive, the louder voices and the more people and the little kids with the baseball bats and the helmets come in to those community meetings, they sort of hijack that discussion. And likewise, it happens with the native environment versus the built environment. How many native environment people show up at those meetings advocating for the native environment? And we depend, to a certain extent, on our sponsors to be able to sort out. It's not a matter of counting votes. It's a matter of just making good sense and making good, responsible decisions. And so I'm backing away from this, and I'm laying it on your lap.
Well, maybe if I can come back as a panelist and ask these tough questions like this that are really, really in the city's ballpark to be answered. But I appreciate the response that consensus building is a challenge, and we have limited space and limited funding to do it all, and so we sometimes have to make tough decisions.
Yeah. True. I could have said it that way, and we'd save some time, but.
You said better, though. It sounded much nicer coming from you. So question to all. Feel free to jump in. So what are some of the challenges preventing wetland restoration along the Brooklyn shoreline? I think we touched on some of the jurisdictional area issues, some regulatory issues. Does anyone want to take that question on?
I can start from the design perspective, and feel free to jump in. I think some of the main challenges we face here are it's a very fast-moving river, right? The East River in general is an extremely fast-moving river, has lots of different varying conditions, and the second part of it, I think, that sometimes doesn't get fully communicated is there's a lot of ferry traffic, To be able to design shorelines where things will stick once you put them in is often a challenge. Not something we should shy away from, but it's just something to be cognizant of. That invest where it makes sense. In some ways, you don't want to put something in the river just to have it float away, so I think that's one of the things that I would say from the perspective of just being a designer is something that we have faced and continue facing.
Wetlands existing is about a very narrow sort of elevation in the water, and you have to have the right slope. And so if we've changed that so much and we've built so far close to the edge, you have a very limited ability to do that with. And so I think we've already sort of covered a lot of the regulatory hurdles and some of the physical hurdles. So I think that's all I'll add.
Could I just add one?
Please.
The waterfront zoning right now is 40 foot. Mm-hmm. Make it 80. That's all it takes.
Good food for thought for our study. More waterfront public access.
It's a good point Tom raises, because there are certain developers who do that, right? They will push further back to relieve more shore public walkway, let's call it. Is it always used for the correct slope? No, because then there's a community process that wants the large ball field. So yes, there are many pieces of the math here that need to fit in. But yeah, it would be nice to have a wider SPW for sure.
Sometimes that extra space means the buildings get a little higher, though, right?
Oh, true.
But yes, great food for thought. So this is so it's kind of a long question, but I'll get through it because I think it's important. So it says, New York City is currently redeveloping a 122-acre of waterfront property in a flood zone through a general project plan. I believe this is talking about the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. That is now a working port. Resiliency and environmental justice seem like an afterthought. How can we hold government more accountable and avoid repeating harms and trade-offs? Any takers?
I'll start just because everybody else seems to be still thinking, and I had to think about this because I think the person who submitted this letter, this might have been writing a letter that I signed on to. And I think we talked about it this weekend. Sanjukta and I are secret friends. So I think one of the things, so this, if you're not familiar, I think this is the Red Hook BMT area, really complicated area. There's an expert over there, pink hair, that can speak to that better than me. And I think, the one big challenge the city has is that in part because of how we have chosen to, or maybe we need to fund resilience projects, we've kind of relied on development to do that. There are other ways, I've mentioned a few. It's hard. And one of the things that I think that project could benefit from is thinking a little bit beyond the edge. We kind of need a comprehensive resilience plan for Red Hook. There's been a lot of work there. The city's done a lot of work there. There's some FEMA-funded projects there, and I think the dynamic there is making sure that there is a process to think about the whole community. And I think, it's a challenge with the city with funding sources and lack thereof that we have, especially with the federal funding pulling back. But we really do need to think, I think, about how we can finance resilience while also having housing and making sure that the whole community is protected and we're not just relying on this one source of funding to do things.
I mean, I'm not familiar with this project in Red Hook, but I think there was I think increasing project accountability is very important, and one way to do this that I learned recently, one instrument that was introduced during the LIRR expansion, so regional-wise, was to introduce community scorecards. They're relatively a small tool, but they allow local residents to evaluate the project on a certain set of quality metrics, such as what the noise, the cleanliness, the impact on traffic, and so I think these systems can be effective in sort of giving community a little bit more weight in these processes. And critically, then the scorecard should be connected to financial compensations to the contractor team with financial penalties or bonuses, depending on whether they're reacting negatively or positively in the community scorecard. So I think things like this could increase community accountability to some extent.
Great. Thank you. One last question. I'll ask this one because we're short on time. And based on what I've heard from the panel, I believe the response will be resounding and relatively brief. So the question is, don't the programs for more resiliency require strong community activism in order to succeed? Case in point, Brooklyn Inlet Park. I'm seeing some head nods.
Yes?
Yes. Okay. Very good. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for entertaining all of these questions from me and the audience. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much.
And thank you, Brendan, for moderating as well. And Kate, your comment about needing funding for some of these projects and ideas and concepts will be explored in panel number 3, Sustaining Public Spaces. So stay tuned. We're going to break for a little bit. We just brought out some sandwiches, refilled our coffee. So take some time, have a break, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone.